Hey everybody, welcome back to Baking with Rosehill Sourdough. This is Mike, and today I'm going to teach you how to make a sourdough culture from scratch. So to make a sourdough culture from scratch, all you need is flour and water. So let's talk about flour for a second. I feed my sourdough culture both wholemeal and bread flour. When we're starting a sourdough culture from scratch, I like to teach the method of just using wholemeal or whole grain flour when you start your culture. And if you can find it, try to use organic flour. All we're doing when we're starting a sourdough starter is capturing the natural yeast and bacteria that happens to be on the grain when it was milled, and the yeast and bacteria that happens to be local to your area. I find that using wholemeal or whole grain flours is the best way to start a culture because it's the whole grain, including the bran, which gives the wholemeal flour its brown color. Now this is important because a lot of that natural yeast that's on the grain while it's growing sits on this bran. When the bran's stripped away to make white flours, we have the chance of losing some of that natural wild yeast. So let's go ahead and get started. First thing you want to do is, the day before you want to start your sourdough culture, you're just going to leave a metal cup out overnight with some water in it. A lot of tap water has chlorine in it, and we don't want that chlorine in the water when we're starting to make our culture. So letting the water sit out overnight, we let the chlorine naturally dissipate from the water. Alright, so it's next morning, and I'm going to take 50 grams of that water, and I'm going to add it to a clean mason jar. To that, I'm going to add 50 grams of my wholemeal flour. You can also use whole grain flour for this. As long as it says wholemeal or whole grain or whole wheat, you're fine. Typically, the only difference between these three types of flours is the grind size, where wholemeal tends to be a little bit more coarse. But that really doesn't matter for our purposes of making a sourdough culture. So now that my flour and water is all mixed up, I'm going to cover it with a loose lid. I'm going to let it sit in my house somewhere warm overnight. Alright, so this next morning, and this is what my sourdough culture looks like. Not a lot of activity, the top layer's kind of dried out. I'm going to scrape through to the bottom layer, and I'm going to remove 50 grams of my sourdough culture and put it into a new fresh jar. To that, I'm going to add 25 grams of water. This doesn't have to be that same water that was left out overnight. You can just use normal tap water now. And 25 grams of my wholemeal flour. I'm going to mix that up, cover it with a loose lid, and let that sit out overnight. So now it's the morning of day 3, and for days 3, 4, 5, and 6, I'm going to repeat the exact same procedure. We have 50 grams of culture, add 25 grams of water, and 25 grams of wholemeal flour, and give that a mix. Cover with a loose lid, let it sit out overnight. So now we're here at the morning of day 7, and we're looking like we're getting some really good activity from our sourdough. See the bubbles along the side? Looks like it's fermenting nicely. So now we're going to start training our sourdough to be ready for bread baking. So over the next 24 hours, we're going to feed our culture 3 times, roughly spaced out about 8 hours apiece. And we're going to start feeding our culture the standard way that I feed all my culture, which is 1, 2, 2. 1 part culture to 2 parts water and 2 parts flour. And for the flour, I'm going to start using a mixture of wholemeal and bread flour. So I've measured out 20 grams of my culture, and to that I'm going to add 40 grams of water, 20 grams of bread flour, and 20 grams of wholemeal flour. I'm going to give that a mix. I like to feed both wholemeal and bread flour to my culture because that's what I typically bake with. I'm trying to train my culture to feed off the flours that I use when I bake bread. After we're done mixing and cleaning the sides of the jar, I'm going to add a rubber band to make sure that this culture is starting to double. In 8 hours, we're going to come back and we're going to feed the culture again using the exact same procedure, and then 8 hours more, we're going to do it one last time. And after your third feeding, you should be seeing something that looks like this. A doubling or maybe even tripling in volume, and at this point, you're ready to continue to maintain this culture and bake all of your sourdough bread and pizza. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have, please give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions, feel free to leave those in the comments below. If you'd like to get any more of my tips and tricks, please follow me on Instagram at Rosehill Sourdough, and I hope to see you back here again soon.